Anthony Albanese looked Australians in the eye and said, "Our plans have not changed."
We have a liar in the lodge.
And he's deceived the public in relation to the tax cuts, which he promised on more than 100 occasions.
After Labor announced it would be changing the Stage 3 tax cuts, we had 2 weeks of non-stop diatribes about broken election promises and how this would spell the end of the Albanese government. Opposition leader Peter Dutton said the policy was so terrible, such a betrayal of the Australian people, so lacking in integrity, that the coalition would have to vote for them. Ladies and gentlemen, the bitch and fold is back.
We're supporting this change, not to support the Prime Minister's lie, but to support those families who need help now.
Now, not to take credit away from Dutton and his team for what was a perfect execution of the manoeuvre, but the coalition aren't the inventors of this particular concept. It's always been a part of Australian politics, but it was particularly honed by Labor oppositions in the last 5 or so years, becoming such a pattern that Guardian's Canberra bureau gave it a nickname. Just before the 2019 election, Labor bitched about how terrible the latest suite of national security laws put forward by the Morrison government were. So terrible that they then voted for them. The rationale being that Bill Shorten would just overturn them when he won the next election. Except we know how that turned out.
I know that you're all hurting, and I am too.
Then came a variety of smaller bitches and folds until we got to the doozy, the Morrison government's OG Stage 3 tax cuts. Labor, under Albanese, spent weeks going on about how terrible the third stage of the policy was, how unfair it was, how it widened inequality. But Morrison and Josh Frydenberg refused to split the legislation, and Labor ended up folding, unwilling to stand in the way of the first 2 stages, which did help lower and middle income wage earners. Labor kept bitching about Stage 3 while telling everyone they would keep it, leading us to the latest and greatest bitch and fold, but this time with the roles reversed. And it came around for the same reason Labor's did: politics. Because it's rarely about the policy itself, it's about avoiding a political wedge. Labor was sick of being painted by the coalition as weak on national security and standing in the way of tax cuts, so it voted for them to neutralise political attacks. And despite the breathless commentary of broken election promises, the coalition worked out that voters were pretty happy with the rejig Stage 3 and didn't particularly care who said what at the election.
So the coalition is not going to stand in the way of providing support to Australians who are doing it tough.
And that's what it comes down to. Australia's major political parties' principles don't stand up to the threat of political attacks. Wedge politics might be held up as a brilliant political tactic, but as we saw with the original Stage 3 tax cuts passed in 2019, it doesn't always mean brilliant policy. This policy is so terrible, we are forced to vote for it, isn't exactly a strong position to defend, as we saw this week with the shoe, for once, on the other foot. So remember, bitch and fold. Bitch and fold. It might just get you to the lodge one day, but voters aren't stupid, and they do eventually see through it. And one day, it's going to be a bitch and fold too far. If you liked this video, subscribe to our channel and stay up to date with the latest videos from Guardian Australia.